A grey November morning had settled upon London when the telegram arrived at Baker Street. I was engaged in reading the morning papers while Holmes sat in his customary chair, consumed by one of those long silences that marked the periods between cases. The lack of mental stimulation always affected him poorly, and I had begun to worry that he might resort to his chemical diversions to combat the ennui. But the arrival of Mrs. Hudson, bearing the yellow envelope, changed everything in an instant. Holmes tore it open with unusual eagerness and scanned its contents. His gray eyes brightened immediately, and I saw the lethargy of recent days vanish like morning mist. "Watson," he said, passing the telegram to me, "we have been summoned to Kent. It appears Lord Ashford requires our immediate assistance in a matter he describes as both urgent and inexplicable." I read the brief message. It requested Holmes's presence at Ashford Manor with all possible haste, mentioning a death under mysterious circumstances within a locked room. The tone was desperate without being hysterical, the mark of a man accustomed to command but now facing something beyond his control. Before I recount the particulars of this singular case, permit me to address those who find pleasure in these chronicles of mystery and detection. If these tales bring any measure of entertainment or instruction, I would be grateful for your support through a simple subscription, a like, or by sharing these accounts with fellow enthusiasts of the curious and the unexplained. Such gestures ensure these stories continue to reach those who appreciate them. With that said, let us turn to the matter that drew us from London to the countryside that grey November day. We departed within the hour, taking the morning train to Sevenoaks. The journey carried us through countryside dressed in the somber colors of late autumn, the fields bare and the trees skeletal against a leaden sky. Holmes spent the journey occasionally consulting a small reference book he had brought from his shelves. When I inquired as to Lord Ashford, Holmes informed me that he was a peer of ancient lineage, a scholar of some reputation, and a collector of rare manuscripts. He is also, Holmes added, a man of rigid habits and considerable intelligence. For him to describe something as inexplicable suggests the matter is genuinely perplexing. At Sevenoaks Station, a carriage awaited us, bearing the Ashford arms upon its door. The driver, a taciturn fellow, offered no conversation as we made our way along winding country lanes. Ashford Manor eventually came into view, a substantial Elizabethan house of weathered stone surrounded by formal gardens now dormant for winter. The house possessed that quality of settled age, as though it had grown from the earth rather than being built upon it. Yet there was something unwelcoming about it that morning, an atmosphere of recent tragedy hanging over the place like the low clouds overhead. We were shown immediately to the library, where Lord Ashford awaited us. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, tall and spare, with white hair and a lined face that spoke of both learning and worry. He greeted Holmes with evident relief, gripping his hand with unusual warmth. "Mr. Holmes, thank God you have come. Dr. Watson, your presence is most welcome as well. I find myself in a situation that defies all rational explanation, and I confess I am at my wit's end." "Pray, tell us what has occurred," Holmes said, settling into a chair with that alert attention he always brought to a new problem. Lord Ashford drew a deep breath and began his account. 3 days ago, my nephew, Gerald Ashford, was found dead in the locked library upstairs. I say locked, Mr. Holmes, and I mean precisely that. The room was secured from the inside, the key in the lock, the windows latched shut. Yet Gerald was discovered with a dagger in his back, lying upon the floor in a pool of blood. No weapon was found in the room save the dagger itself. No means of exit could be discovered. It is as though a phantom entered a sealed chamber, committed murder, and vanished into thin air. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. "Tell me about the room itself. When was it last accessed before the body was discovered?" "The evening before Gerald was found. He had requested permission to examine certain manuscripts in my collection. The upper library houses my most valuable volumes, and access is restricted. I personally unlocked the room for him at 8 o'clock that evening. He wished to work undisturbed, so I left him there, with instructions to lock the door from within. He was to return the key to me when he finished. And the next morning? When Gerald did not appear for breakfast, I became concerned. He was punctual in all his habits. I went to the library and found the door still locked. I knocked, but received no answer. Growing alarmed, I summoned the butler and the footman. We broke down the door, and there we found Gerald lying dead, the key still in the inside lock, which it had turned. The windows were latched from within. There was no other exit from the room. Mr. Holmes, I have examined every inch of that library. There is no secret passage, no concealed door, no means by which anyone could have entered or left." "What of the murder weapon?" Holmes inquired. "A distinctive piece, an antique dagger from my collection, kept in a display case in the drawing room downstairs. It had been taken sometime during the previous day. The case was found open, though no one recalls seeing it disturbed. The dagger itself is Italian, 16th century, with an elaborately worked hilt, unmistakable in its appearance." "Had your nephew any enemies?" "None that I am aware of. Gerald was quiet, scholarly, somewhat withdrawn. He had private means and lived simply. His interests were historical research. I cannot imagine who would wish him harm, let alone commit such a crime in such an impossible manner." Holmes rose from his chair. "I should like to examine the library immediately, if you would be so kind as to show us the way." Lord Ashford led us from the comfortable library, where we had been speaking, up a broad staircase to the first floor. We proceeded along a corridor lined with portraits of previous Ashfords, their painted eyes seeming to follow our progress. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy oak door, newly repaired where it had been forced. "This is the room," Lord Ashford said quietly. "Nothing has been moved since we found him. I thought it best to await your arrival before disturbing anything." Holmes examined the door first, studying the lock mechanism with his magnifying glass. "The lock is of good quality and shows no signs of tampering. The damage is entirely consistent with forcing from outside. Watson, observe the position of the key." I looked and saw that the key remained in the lock on the inside of the door, turned to the locked position. "Quite clear," I said. The room was indeed locked from within. We entered the library, and I confess the sight arrested me. It was a magnificent chamber, perhaps 30 feet long and 20 wide, with tall windows along one wall and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lining the others. A fireplace occupied the center of one long wall, cold now and showing no signs of recent use. Several reading tables stood about the room, and upon the floor near one of these lay a dark stain, where Gerald Ashford's blood had pooled. The outline of where his body had fallen was still faintly visible. Holmes moved about the room with methodical precision. He examined the windows, testing each latch and inspecting the frames for any sign of disturbance. He scrutinized the bookshelves, pulling volumes aside to check the walls behind them. He studied the floorboards, the ceiling, the fireplace. All the while I watched, knowing better than to interrupt his concentration. Lord Ashford stood near the door, his face grave with concern and puzzlement. After nearly half an hour, Holmes straightened from his examination of the fireplace and turned to us. Lord Ashford, tell me about the manuscripts your nephew was examining. What specifically had drawn his interest? Ah, yes. Gerald had been researching the correspondence of Sir Philip Ashford, who served Queen Elizabeth. We possess a collection of his letters and documents. Gerald believed there might be information of historical significance among them, something that had been overlooked by previous scholars. He had been working on this research for several months. And where are these documents kept? In those cabinets there, along the far wall. They are organized chronologically in leather portfolios. Holmes crossed to the cabinets and began examining them. He opened several, flipping through the contents with care. Then he paused, studying one particular portfolio with intense interest. Lord Ashford, how many people knew of your nephew's research? Very few. The family, of course. My son Richard, who is currently traveling on the continent. The household staff would have been aware Gerald spent time in this library, but I doubt they knew the specifics. Gerald was not one to discuss his work widely. What of other scholars? Might someone have learned of his research through academic channels? Lord Ashford considered this. Possibly. Gerald did correspond with other historians. He may have mentioned his work in his letters. Holmes closed the portfolio he had been examining and turned to face us fully. There is something here that does not fit the obvious pattern. Watson, you noted the blood pool? Yes, substantial, consistent with the described wound. Indeed. And you will observe it lies near this reading table, some 15 feet from the door and roughly the same distance from the windows.
Yet consider, a man is working at this table. Someone enters through a locked door, crosses 15 feet of open floor, stabs him in the back, and then vanishes, leaving the door still locked. It strains credulity. That is precisely my difficulty, Lord Ashford said. The physical facts seem impossible to reconcile with what must have occurred. Holmes began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. Let us approach this differently. Your nephew came here at 8 in the evening. When precisely was his body discovered? The following morning, shortly after 9 o'clock. Breakfast is served at 8, and by 8:30 his absence was noted. I went to investigate immediately thereafter. So he was alone in this room for approximately 13 hours. During that time, did anyone hear any disturbance, any cry, any sound of struggle? Nothing was reported. The household had retired for the night by 10 o'clock. The servants' quarters are in another wing, and the family rooms are on the floor below. This corridor would have been quite silent through the night. Holmes moved to the window and gazed out at the grounds below. What lies directly beneath this room? The morning room, which was unoccupied that evening. Below that, the cellars. Holmes turned back to us, and I saw that peculiar expression on his face that indicated he had perceived something significant. Lord Ashford, I should like to examine the morning room and the cellars beneath it. I should also like to see the dagger that was used in the crime. We descended to the morning room, a pleasant chamber with windows matching those above. Holmes examined it briefly, then requested access to the cellars. The butler was summoned with keys, and we made our way down narrow stone stairs into the undercroft of the house. The cellars were what one would expect: vaulted stone chambers used for storage, wine racks, and the various practical necessities of a large house. Holmes moved through them with purpose, examining the ceiling joists and the walls. At length, he stopped beneath what I calculated must be directly under the library. He studied the stonework above with his magnifying glass, then produced a small knife and scraped at the mortar between stones. A fine dust fell, and Holmes caught some in his palm, examining it closely. "Most interesting," he murmured. "Lord Ashford, has there been any construction or repair work in this section of the house recently?" "Not to my knowledge. The house is old but well maintained. We attend to problems as they arise, but there has been nothing major in this area for years." "I see. And the dagger, if you please?" We returned upstairs to the drawing room, where Lord Ashford produced a wooden case containing the murder weapon. It was indeed a magnificent piece, as he had described. The blade was perhaps 8 inches long, slightly curved, with an elaborately worked hilt featuring golden scrollwork. Holmes examined it with great care, holding it to the light, testing its balance, studying every detail. "This was found in your nephew's body?" "Yes. The police surgeon removed it and returned it to me. I kept it as evidence, hoping you would examine it." Holmes set the dagger down with a thoughtful expression. "Lord Ashford, I have seen enough. I believe I understand what occurred in your locked library. But to prove it, I shall need to conduct a small experiment tonight. With your permission, I should like Watson and myself to keep vigil in the library this evening, under conditions similar to those when your nephew died." Lord Ashford looked startled. "You believe the killer might return?" "I believe certain truths will reveal themselves only under the proper circumstances. Will you permit this?" "Of course, whatever you require." Holmes smiled slightly. "Excellent. We shall need the room prepared as it was that night. The key left in the inside lock, the windows latched. We shall enter before dark and remain until morning if necessary. I ask only that no one disturb us, regardless of what sounds they may hear." The arrangements were made. As dusk fell, Holmes and I entered the library. Lord Ashford locked the door behind us from the outside, and we immediately unlocked it from within and turned the key to the locked position, replicating the conditions found the next morning. Holmes had brought several items with him: his lantern, his magnifying glass, various small tools, and, remarkably, a length of strong cord. "Watson," he said once we were secured, "position yourself near the window and observe carefully. I believe I know what happened here, but the proof will require patience." I did as instructed, taking a chair near the window while Holmes positioned himself near the fireplace. He extinguished all but one small lamp, leaving the room in deep shadow. Then we waited. The hours passed slowly. The house grew silent around us. I confess I began to doubt whether anything would occur, but Holmes remained alert, his eyes fixed on the fireplace. Near midnight, I heard a faint sound, a soft scraping that seemed to come from within the fireplace itself. Holmes raised his hand, signaling silence. The sound continued, growing gradually louder. Then, to my astonishment, one of the stones at the back of the fireplace began to move. I watched in fascination as the stone shifted inward, revealing a dark opening beyond. A moment later, a figure emerged from the opening, moving with careful stealth into the room. The intruder was dressed in dark clothing and carried something that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Holmes waited until the figure had fully entered the room, then struck a match and lit our lamp. "Good evening," he said calmly. "I believe you have some explaining to do." The intruder spun around with a cry of shock. In the sudden light, I saw a man of perhaps 35 years, lean and dark-haired, with the weathered look of someone accustomed to outdoor labor. He still held the object he had been carrying, a leather portfolio similar to those in the cabinets. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough with fear. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We have been expecting you. Or rather, expecting someone to use the hidden passage you have just demonstrated so conveniently." The man looked wildly about, seeking escape, but I had already positioned myself between him and the window, my service revolver drawn. Holmes continued in that same calm voice. "You are, I believe, Thomas Garrett, employed as a gardener on this estate. You murdered Gerald Ashford 3 nights ago, and you have returned tonight to complete the theft you began then. The documents in that portfolio are what you came for, are they not?" The man's shoulders sagged, defeat written plainly on his features. "How did you know?" "Deduction, Mr. Garrett. The locked room presented a pretty puzzle, but certain facts pointed toward a solution. The position of the body suggested the victim had not heard his attacker approach. A man working at a table is alert to sounds from the door or windows, but not from the fireplace behind him. The presence of dust in the cellar ceiling mortar indicated recent disturbance. The fireplace, though it appeared solid, must contain some mechanism for access. And finally, the theft of documents suggested a motive beyond simple murder. Lord Ashford, alerted by our voices, arrived with servants and the local constable. The full story emerged over the next hours. Thomas Garrett had been approached by an unscrupulous collector who had learned of the Ashford manuscripts and wished to acquire certain documents that would never be sold legally. Garrett, heavily in debt, had agreed to steal them. He knew of the hidden passage, an old priest hole dating from Elizabeth's reign. On the night in question, Gerald Ashford had been alone in the library. Garrett entered through the fireplace passage and attempted to take the documents quietly, but Gerald heard him and confronted him. In panic, Garrett had seized the dagger, which he had brought from downstairs earlier as a threat, and stabbed Gerald in the struggle. He fled back through the passage, leaving the room locked as it had been.
But he had not secured all the documents he needed, and so had returned tonight to complete his crime. The police took Garrett into custody, and the hidden passage was revealed to be a masterwork of Tudor engineering, cunningly concealed behind the fireplace back. As Holmes and I prepared to return to London the following morning, Lord Ashford thanked us with genuine warmth. "You have solved what seemed an impossible mystery, Mr. Holmes. I confess I had begun to believe in supernatural agency." Holmes smiled. "There is no mystery that cannot be explained by natural means, Lord Ashford, provided one observes carefully and thinks clearly. Your locked library was indeed locked, but it had a second door you had forgotten existed." We returned to Baker Street that afternoon, and as our train carried us through the gray November landscape, I reflected on the case. "Holmes," I said, "when did you first suspect the hidden passage?" He gazed out at the passing countryside. "From the beginning, Watson. The age of the house, built during a time when such features were common, made it probable. The dust in the cellar and the scratches on the hearthstone confirmed it. The impossible, once explained, always proves to have been possible all along. The locked library of Lord Ashford had indeed concealed the secret, but that secret was architectural rather than mystical. And once discovered, all became clear. That is the essence of Holmes's method, to strip away the dramatic and the supernatural, revealing the logical truth beneath.